when discussing the definition of DAO or even the terms like decentralized autonomous organization, you'll find people don't agree. You can talk to a bunch of different people who will have issue with each one of those worlds, right? Like, to what extent are DAOs decentralized? To what extent are they actually autonomous? To what extent are they organizations even? I've heard people complain about that and criticize like that.
Hi everyone, and welcome yet to another episode of NewForum. NewForum is powered by Newcoin Foundation and is focused on fostering decentralized social applications, also known as Social 3.0, by forming an ecosystem and a community of visionaries, creators, and investors to spark conversations on the topics of crypto, the metaverse, NFTs, and everything Web3.
And on this episode of NewForum, we're super honored to have Connor Spelliscy. Connor is the founder of the DAO Research Collective, co-founder of the Blockchain Association and the Canadian Web3 Council. Besides that, Connor is also a mentor at Creative Labs. We're honored and thrilled to talk with him about DAO structuring, governance, and how he sees ecosystems around blockchains and DAOs evolving. Hey, Connor, we're happy you could join us today. And how are you today?
Hey guys, nice to be here. I'm well, thanks.
Perfect.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, likewise. And so when was the first time you heard about Web3 and blockchain, and what was the experience like for you?
I heard about it, I guess one of the first times was like, would have been summer of 2017 when my brother's a developer. His friends started buying Bitcoin and Eth. But it was made most apparent to me that it was something that's interesting. There's an organization called Singularity University, which has kind of a lot of a big focus, I guess, on new tech. And I was at one of their events and saw a presentation by Andreas Antonopoulos on Bitcoin and on crypto. And around that same time, when I was a lawyer and realized, this is something that's going to be really critical to the legal industry, or at least a field that's going to be very relevant. So I was at a large Canadian law firm at the time. And so I helped start their crypto practice around that time. So that's when it first came to mind, is something that, this is not only something that exists and is really interesting, but something that I should start working on actively.
That's really interesting. So you were a lawyer before, and then you got to know the blockchain Web3 space, and you totally were like, okay, I'm gonna switch my career. So how did you go with that transition?
I guess it was a part of switching my direction as a lawyer at first, where I'm thinking, okay, like I was a young lawyer at the time at a big, what we call Seven Sisters firm. I wanted to make my mark pretty quickly. I didn't want to wait around too much. And I think we're very fortunate in that blockchain has come around at a time when maybe many of us are, entering the business world, I suppose. And so we are benefiting from the existence of this new technology, and we can be the first ones to learn about it and get it in early to some extent on something that's going to be a transformational technology, and already is. So when I learned about its existence, I thought, this can be something that I could explore and I could sort of take control of in my firm. And so that's where I started with it. But while at the firm, I met with Polychain related to a deal we were doing, and they're a large venture firm in the space. And particularly then they were one of the largest, and they had some organizations that needed more direct legal help and asked me if I'd come in-house for some of them, which I ultimately did. And so pretty quickly after helping to start the crypto practice at my firm, I left to start helping these Polychain companies. And while there, I realized, okay, I can help them to some extent as a lawyer, and I can bring in external counsel to give us advice about how to do things in a compliant way from different jurisdictions. But that external counsel can't really give me any good advice about what is and what is not compliant, in large part because they don't have any guidance. Like the government has not given them any policy or guidance, right? Such that they can't go and in turn tell startups, what that startup can do. So realized pretty quickly on what we need actually are industry associations. We need to not just talk to lawyers, we need to talk to government and help them understand crypto and blockchain, how it can be useful, and how regulations and policy needs to be amended in order to encourage innovation in crypto, and like responsible innovation, of course, but innovation period. So I co-founded an organization called the Blockchain Association, which is a leading industry association in crypto. And I did that with a number of other great organizations like Protocol Labs and Hanger and DCG and a few others. And it's now grown into something much larger, but that was the vision. And that is honestly still the goal in large part. That's what I spend a lot of my time thinking about, is how can we help governments around the world understand how transformative crypto can be, blockchain can be, and how it can be used really for good, which is where I see, its potential is in helping to coordinate and fund public goods.
No, that's really interesting. So I'm thinking about community and DAOs and everything. I'm just wondering how do you see, how does DAOs differ from an LLC?
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, like in thinking about, some DAOs might actually wrap their DAO in an LLC. I think that's probably a pretty tough way of doing it. But I might even start with the definition of DAO. Like it's pretty, when discussing the definition of DAO or even the terms like decentralized autonomous organization, you'll find people don't agree. You can talk to a bunch of different people who will have issue with each one of those worlds, right? Like to what extent are DAOs decentralized? To what extent are they actually autonomous? To what extent are they organizations even? I've heard people complain about that and criticize like that aspect of the terminology. So when we think about DAOs, are we thinking about, I was chatting with a guy named Nathan Schneider, who's like very thoughtful person in the space. And he was mentioning, I think that he thought that his like mother's gardening club was a DAO essentially. And a DAO might just be, right, a group of people who maybe share some capital and are making decisions with an informal structure to some extent. We could narrow that definition and say it's a group of people with pooled capital with like some aspect of decision-making being on chain. Like that could be a version of it. When we think about DAOs versus LLCs, I mean, DAOs can be anything, right? Like a DAO could be wrapped in an LLC or a different kind of legal formation. Like when we think about maybe some of the best comparables to a DAOs in terms of like function that are existing kinds of legal organizations, I think things like cooperatives. And so cooperatives are a really weird form of organization in many ways. We probably interact with them a lot. Like your insurance company might be a mutual, which is a form of cooperative without you knowing it. Or like in the States, there's a company called REI, which is a big cooperative, and it's like a sporting goods cooperative. And we had one in Canada too called the Mountain Equipment Co-op. And so it's an odd structure that's existed for a long time, but it looks a lot more like a DAO than an LLC would. Of course, DAOs, generally don't have shareholders; they have token holders. In the same way that cooperatives have stakeholders, have members who are not themselves shareholders in the cooperative. So when making the comparison, I guess, between DAOs and LLCs, it's almost like an apples and oranges thing to me, because a DAO is just a way to coordinate and structure a group of people, while an LLC is like a very specific corporate entity, which could maybe play a role in a DAO, but likely shouldn't be used or lean on too heavily if you're trying to like create the kind of DAO that we think about when we're thinking about like like a Web3 forward organization.
You as a lawyer, Connor, do you think that there's like a crash of a clash of the crypto world and the government world, I would say? How do we navigate? Like some people are really far within crypto and within blockchain, and there's like right now regulations and policies coming into place. I think in Europe there was another one announced, or I know it's in discussion. So what do you think? Where do we stand right now?
So I'm a former lawyer in that I was a lawyer, and then I no longer am licensed as a lawyer because it's just not nearly as fun as sort of participating in the advocacy side of crypto and crypto operation stuff. So that's where I am. So none of this is legal advice, of course, but I actually stepped away from that game. Where I do participate a lot is on the advocacy side. So how can we work with government to help them understand like the potential for crypto and responsible regulation for crypto? But you're totally right. Like it's interesting. When I first came into the industry, that was very much the narrative. Is you talk to the average person who's a builder, and they would say, "This is an international jurisdiction. Like we don't have to abide by anyone's laws. We don't abide by anyone's laws." But I think almost like very broadly, at least with most, you can be a mission-driven person who believes that. Okay, fine. But for most, I would say, sophisticated businesses in the space, that it's going to be almost impossible to operate if you're working in a jurisdiction or selling products in a jurisdiction, or at least very difficult to operate if you're like, oh, government doesn't matter, we're gonna not be compliant, because that'll generally come back to bite you. Maybe you'll be a nod and be able to avoid things for a long time, but it's really not how I think the industry needs to build out. Like, there are many reasons for government to want to coordinate with the crypto industry. And for the industry, it's so much better if this is something that can be done right in the light, consistent with regulations. Like, this is how we really onboard the next billion people. It's by earning the trust of government, by having institutions participate to some extent in crypto. We want to be tactical about that, right? Because what will happen, what is probably already happening to some extent, is that there's a watering down maybe of what the people who originally envisioned this technology, like it envisioned its potential and maybe its parameters. There's a bit of a watering down there. And so regulation will come in, which will change DeFi, it'll change stablecoin operations, it'll change a number of different things. We as an industry have to be there at the forefront to say, hey, hold on, right? There's a reason that decentralized stablecoins can be very important, as well as centralized stablecoins. There's a reason why DeFi is an incredible technology that can help coordinate and onboard a ton of people in the financial system who are currently being excluded from the financial system. But without us as an industry being there to tell government all about that, they're just going to assume the worst, right? Or they're going to read the headlines, or they're going to take information from major institutions which see crypto as a threat, and they're, with that information being the only information available to them, they're going to take action on the regulatory side to slow the pace of growth and development in crypto, and potentially in some jurisdictions try to wipe out the industry entirely.
So in terms of like DAO structuring, everyone says like DAOs are the next big thing after NFTs. And I feel like lately, like everyone is talking about DAOs. When we have guests, we realize that the conversation is always like on the DAO side of Web3. And I'm just curious to know, do you think that DAO structures are like good for everything? Like everything should be a DAO like structure, should take on?
Yeah, definitely not. I would say. Why? I mean, if we kind of look at, when we think about DAOs, you're like, what? Maybe when you think about the function of a project or an initiative, you'll have to consider whether there is some benefit in the kind of centralized way it's currently being run versus like, what is the upside of transferring something into a DAO, right? And maybe taking like a very basic example, like there's a convenience store at the end of my street. Like, should that be a DAO? Should everyone who buys goods at the convenience store have a token and make decisions about what the convenience store does and who it onboards and what its hiring system is and who they are, like what their design and like communities, like should that convenience store have a Discord so we don't communicate about, like, of course it's completely outrageous and would never work. And you'd have to participate in one of those things in every aspect of your life, like my convenience store, the restaurants that I go to, like there's just any number of things I'm seeing that are being converted into DAOs. But often I find that the people who are doing the conversion are just looking to make a dollar, or are really excited and maybe not thinking really critically about the governance of that organization or the implications of what happens when you do something like launching a token. And it might almost be surprising, because I run an organization called the DAO Research Collective, which I founded and I'm super excited about. So why am I shooting down the idea of DAOs? Like, I think DAOs are an incredible structure, and they have such high potential for coordinating communities and like having joint and really unique forms of stakeholder ownership that are much more equitable than we see in a corporation. So I love it. I think we're like really at day zero with DAOs, and there are so many cool problems to be solved around legal structuring, around governance, treasury management, like DEI initiatives. So many things that the community jointly should be working on, and is to some extent working on. And I mean, that's in part what we do at the DAO Research Collective. We gather resources from a bunch of different organizations, and we're primarily funded by the Ethereum Foundation and Compound and Uniswap and Aave grants programs at the moment, but we'll probably continue to expand on that and just pool resources from DAOs to then turn around and procure an open source research that's going to be relevant to all of them. So when we think about things like legal structuring, like how should a governance system actually work? What are real world examples of governance systems that work that we can look to and apply to DAOs? All of those things. So it's a bit of a long answer, but definitely not everything should be a DAO. Like there's a reason that some things are centralized and it's easier to coordinate, and maybe that's how it should be. But there are lots of very significant things which I think would benefit from being a DAO and would allow for like a more equitable space.
Can you give some examples of what you think DAOs are like best for?
Yeah, I think that like maybe I'll bring up a few like specific ones, but also flag that I think we're so early that I really like couldn't anticipate all of the amazing use cases of DAOs going forward. But I think in instances where you have like maybe one of my favorite examples is when I talk to people about like crypto public goods is Helium. And so I used to work in the broadband space. And one of the things that we did was how can we build financial models which allow for us to bridge the digital divide in communities that are currently underserved from a broadband perspective, right? The digital divide being there are many communities, particularly poorer communities, that don't have access to good internet, which puts them at a major disadvantage when we talk about like business competitive, onboard people, et cetera. But the way in the States, at least it looks, is it's very difficult to make a case for building a broadband network in certain communities, largely because of competitors. So like monopolistic competitors like AT&T, which really work really closely with state legislators, blah, blah, blah. Along comes Helium. And so like we tried very hard to build like broad models that would work, and it's hard to build and usually they wouldn't work. But Helium shows up and they offer a model where they have this incredible network of node operators, and you can spin up your own node and you earn Helium tokens in exchange for you running that node. And to me, that kind of almost public good, right? Like I see that infrastructure as a public good in many ways. If that is something that is being developed because many stakeholders have decided, I'm going to run a Helium node. And I think individuals like that should be rewarded with things like Helium token. That seems great to me. But also, you're now playing a major role in the development of a technology which will be really foundational to the way that your society operates. And it strikes me that in a situation like that, this could be something that would be worth making into a DAO. Like I would really love for major corporations that have huge amounts of control in the States and Canada and elsewhere, like maybe a good example is AT&T, which has like significant control of the internet and many other fields in the States. I would love for that entity to be controlled in part by token holders, by stakeholders in the network. And it doesn't mean that they need to vote on every decision within that organization. But if they could see some benefit from the existence of that organization, if that organization could see them as something that's more than just, they could potentially be shareholders, but that wouldn't provide them with the same sort of power and flexibility as being in a DAO would allow for them to take on. So when I think of the most exciting use case for DAOs, it's actually like the very massive scale. And I don't think I know we haven't figured out governance yet, right? Like we look at Uniswap, at Compound, at some of the DAOs with the biggest treasuries, and it's really hard to make effective use of those treasuries. And the jury's kind of out on what those treasuries should even do. Like, should they diversify and kind of hedge against the risk of the token dropping, or should they just hold their token forever? Should they do buybacks? What is it that this treasury should do? We're not totally sure. But I love the direction they take in saying, hey, this is essentially like a public good in many ways. It would be great for our token holders to have a large say. And as a token holder, it's pretty incredible how engaged you can be. Like when we look at a DAO like Uniswap, when you're making your proposal, you're on the forum, you're in Snapchat, your comment, can be like a comment from the founder of the protocol, like from Hayden or something. And then below him is like a comment from like Kitty Cat 69, right? Like it's just sort of this equity that's already existing, an early form of DAO governance, which I think as we grow more sophisticated and we grow to better understand what are effective governance mechanisms for DAOs, we can like distill that into something that actually works. It's currently not working too well, but once we have that, it would be incredible to continue applying that to not only stuff that's being built up in Web3 now, but also to these major organizations which have sort of weird incentives and kind of end up forming into like these monopolistic organizations like AT&T, the likes of which I'd like to see less of exist in the United States and around the world.
Yeah, I think you have a very interesting perspective, obviously, coming from the law perspective and being into the DAO Research Collective. And I'm wondering what kind of like structures and policies have to be, from your experience, in place to make it function. I think about like leadership and how hard it must be to lead this DAO and how much pressure because it must be to figure this thing out. And I'm wondering, what do you think could be some policies or structures in place that make it more smooth for onboarding for users and really taking part in the DAO?
Interesting, because I thought I thought you were going to go like, it must be really hard for policymakers and regulators to figure out kind of what they should do for DAO.
Yeah.
Because that part is also really true, right? Like, can you imagine if you're like a policymaker and you make decisions every month about like astronaut funding and like veterans benefits, and then someone shows up and is like, Web3, here, learn all about Web3 immediately and make a decision about how to best govern DAOs, right? It is very difficult. But I think on the founder side, like in terms of breaking that down a little bit, like in terms of how to engage people, how to engage stakeholders so they're actually interested and incentivized to participate in governance. I mean, that's a great open question, and it's one that we're dealing with a lot right now. Like you can look at some of the major DAOs and how they're like dealing with these issues, and they're trying to incentivize participants in different ways. Like they want people to be making proposals, they want people to be executing on those proposals. But there aren't that many proposals that get passed. And it is rather political to pass those proposals as well. Like if you're an anon making a proposal, odds are it probably won't be passed. You instead have to be someone who already has, generally speaking, this is generalization, and it depends on the DAO, of course, but like the more credibility you already have within the organization, the better off you are that your proposal is going to be passed. So it discourages a lot of people from taking that step of actually making a proposal to a DAO. And also when we think about, is this the best function, like one where token holders are voting on such a huge variety of different things. Like for instance, should Gauntlet be a service provider for this DAO? Should the DAO provide funding to Nomic Labs because Nomic Labs provides public goods which are relevant to the DAO? It's just so much decision fatigue that the expectation that the average stakeholder, like token holder, will want to participate and learn is, we're seeing that that's not playing out. So part of the first thing I think founders need to think about is what existing governance system can we look to that is working, can we leverage for our own community? Because DAOs are new and the technology is new, and that's awesome and it's very exciting. But the human condition hasn't changed so much in the last like 20 years, right? We're still incentivized by the same things, and humans have found ways to organize themselves and like tested different things and built different governance structures over the last hundreds of years, which are really relevant to how DAO founders should think about onboarding and incentivizing people in their community. So we're still in such an early experimentation phase as it relates to how can we incentivize people to participate in governance? What should this look like? Should we have politicians, like DAO politicians who are delegated votes? Like to some extent, we're sort of seeing an ENS. Should we make it a one token holder vote, one vote situation? Obviously, I'm not a big fan of that. Should it be something in between? Should there be many committees? Some DAOs fund organizations, like Uniswap funded the DeFi Education Fund, which itself is like fulfilling a pretty critical function for Uniswap, but also providing like a public goods function. Maker sort of had a legal entity and then it disbanded, but there's funding going to many different organizations which fulfill many of the same roles as I understand, as that entity previously did before it disbanded. So they're all experiments. The thing is, we need to track them. Like we need to track these experiments to see how they're doing. And then founders today should apply those learnings to their DAOs tomorrow, so they don't have to deal with the same problems as the DAOs are dealing with that founded themselves like 6 months ago, 12 months ago. And that's like one of the things I'm really focused on is how can we track this? How can we bring in people from the academic side, from the business side, who've done things that are similar to this, who can provide insight to founders. Many of these founders don't have a good sense of like how governance systems work, right? They can be incredibly talented people and not have that information, while that information is going to be really critical to the success of their organization.
Yeah, I think it takes a good look for like overseeing human structures and like working structures and government structures to really think critically about these things, and think like what is really making sense. And going with like structures, like what do you think about like, we talk about decentralization of Web3, but are we there yet? Or is it like, I don't know, like how do you see we are moving forward with decentralization? Because when we started like joining the Web3 space, I feel like there was such an excitement for everything is going to be decentralized, and we are all gonna not be like we don't have this problem with data, and we are not going to stick on one platform and all these things. But we see kind of that it doesn't really work out like that, and I'm wondering what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like with all this stuff, we're early still, right? It's funny when I first like got into this space. I remember coming in and learning about like projects like Aragon, and in my mind, I'm like, okay, governance is figured out. Like we have Aragon, which exists, and so like we no longer have to be concerned about governance or think about it. In the same way that I think a lot of people enter the space today and they're like, oh, decentralization, this stuff is decentralized. That's great, but you just pull back the surface a little bit and you appreciate, none of this really means anything. Like the governance is a really nebulous concept that has not been perfected in the corporate form, which has existed for hundreds of years. So why should I expect that it would be perfected within like the crypto form, right? So it's something that we absolutely have to keep working on. Decentralization is the same in my view. Like, first of all, what's the definition of decentralization, right? Do you need a network like as decentralized as Ethereum? Is it about a certain number of core contributors? Is it about a certain number of validators, different validator power? Is it about influencers in the community who are making decisions? Like, how do we measure decentralization? And more people are writing on this. Like, I think a law firm called Quetzal did a really cool piece on this. And Miles Jennings, who's the general counsel at Andreessen Horowitz Crypto, he recently wrote a piece on decentralization and how we can think about it for different projects. So I think that kind of work is incredible because it's not hand wavy. It's like specifically, this is what we think decentralization is. This should count. And there's definitely a spectrum. And on one side of the extreme is centralized, I suppose, and one is decentralized. So will we ever reach decentralization, or is it just sort of an ambition? Well, we can certainly get much closer to that than we are right now. And it'll take a long time to do in a way that's effective, particularly. Like, there are benefits to centralization in that it can at times be much more efficient, of course, right? And so with these new toolings, can we get to a place where decentralization is equally efficient? How decentralized can we get? Right? What's the right balance? Are all things that need to be figured out. So I'm definitely optimistic that we'll get there, but it's kind of a moving target at the moment because I think that we need to balance like what's realistic with, balance what's realistic with like what is also consistent with the ethos of this community.
Like I said earlier on, we're all learning as we go, and I'm definitely like processing everything you're saying, and it's really interesting. And I guess with this space for me, it's just like the idea of the potential, because sometimes we have guests or we interact with people in general about Web3, and sometimes I'm like, I don't want to use the word, but you sound like a pessimist, because there are people who are like, they're in Web3, they're actively doing things in Web3, but then they're also not patient, I think, because they want things to happen immediately. And so sometimes it can be discouraging, but then it's really good to just like be in this mindset of like knowing that it's not going to happen immediately, but everybody is working towards that. And speaking about like Web3 and all of that, I'm wondering, like, you are pretty much a founder in Web3, right? And I'm just wondering, how is it like, being a founder, an entrepreneur in Web3? Is it any different from how, I'm sure you worked in like a corporate Web2 space as well. So I'm wondering if, how has this experience been for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. Like I think part of it is maybe my personal experience that I've had so far, because you can enter Web3 space and you can have a horrible time if you're working with the wrong people. Like, you could be working with bad actors who aren't building anything of value and find that it's not very useful way to spend your time, or it could be a really negative experience. But for me, I've had a truly incredible experience, and it was it was polar opposite, right? Like I was working in a great law firm. I really liked my firm and the people there, but the law firm life, especially 4.5 years ago, it's changed a little bit, but 4.5 years ago, it was like super straight. You're wearing a suit and tie every day. You work 70 hours a week. That's kind of your life and your thing. And then I transitioned from that to like, I'm with my team and we're co-living together in SF, and then we're moving to Berlin all together, and we're just going to all of these jam, like, you know, these jam idea sessions. And so it was a complete night and day experience for me. And part of it, honestly, is are people comfortable with that lifestyle? And I'm not saying my Web3 experience is like the average one. It's maybe more on the like kind of decentralized digital nomad-y side of things. If you go to start working at Coinbase today, I imagine your experience is quite a bit different. Like it's a massive organization. I'm sure they need to have way more policies in place. You could probably have like a pretty straightforward desk job at Coinbase. The parts that are most interesting to me in the space are like the fringes to some extent. Like I work with a lot of organizations that I absolutely love, like the Interchain Foundation, which is Cosmos, and the Ethereum Foundation and Gitcoin. And they are organizations that are very much working on the edge. And I love working with those kinds of groups. And I love traveling to go meet them. And I love going to events to go see people that I've been collaborating with virtually for a long time. And so much about the culture and community, I've really come to enjoy. But now that the space is getting bigger much more quickly, I think that there are so many different communities and cultures that I honestly haven't been too exposed to. Like you're talking about NFTs, and I am aware of NFTs, and I think there's a lot of cool use cases for them. And I'm really excited about what they can enable, but I haven't gone to like NFT conferences or anything like that. And I'm sure those conferences look a lot different than Ethereum Foundation conferences, which look a lot different from like Bitcoin Miami. And so, yeah, it's almost at this stage probably hard to wrap your arms around mind around all the different communities and cultures that exist within Web3 as it grows so quickly. But I do have to say that like I absolutely love it. And once you get deeper in the technology too, you appreciate how world-changing this can be, what the potential is. And I think once you're there, it's essentially impossible to go back to Web2. Like I couldn't think of anything more boring. Like there's not amount of money you could pay me to go like build an app to do something for someone, like to be, I remember in 2011 or 12 or whatever, thinking like, oh, what can be the next Uber? Like what Uber equivalent can I build, right? Everyone wanted to do that. Or was it like WeWork, like build the next WeWork? Like those models are so boring as compared to what can be built in Web3. I could just literally never go back to that experience.
Wow, that's amazing. And I wanted to correct myself. So Connor, you're a mentor at Creative Lab, not a founder. Sorry, I made a mistake. So Connor is he's a founder of the DAO Research Collective and co-founder of the Blockchain Association. And so you're quite busy. How do you keep yourself sane in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in crypto, and you guys probably find this too, but like you just end up working for a lot of different projects. And for me, that's almost a big value add for every project that I work with. I mean, in part on the advocacy side, like a big part of participating in advocacy and like policy is getting information from different organizations and sources, and then helping to share that information and help to organize people. And so the more people you know and you're collaborating with, the easier it is for you to organize and the easier it is for you to have an impact. So from my perspective, like with the Blockchain Association, I co-founded it, but then I stepped back, and it's really been the team there that's been running it amazingly well for the last 4 years. And I help, and I participated as a board observer, and I've raised money for them, and I brought people on board, and I collaborate with them a lot, and they're great friends, but it's not something that I'm spending like 20 hours a week on. So I find that I work in roles that are all very complementary. And that's how I stay sane, is I don't always have to context switch that much, because a lot of what I'm doing is really similar. So thinking about advocacy and policy, thinking about DAOs, talking to researchers and kind of thought leaders in the space, helping them with their writing, helping them think about how we can like build community among these kinds of organizations. But yeah, totally fair point. You don't want to be too spread thin. Though at the beginning, I think it's great for people to be like looking at a lot of different things to see what interests them. And then ultimately, you might find yourself in a position where you can be working for 2 to 5 different organizations in a way you've never done before. And I would say be open to it, because there's a world in which that's just the best way for you to maximize your value.
Oh, beautifully said. Thank you. Really, thank you so much. I think this has been a really, it's been a brief conversation, but everything has been really like on point, and you've brought like a really brilliant perspective on DAOs. And yeah, we really appreciate your time with us. And I'm wondering, where can our listeners or our community find you? Because I'm sure they would love to follow you to see what else you're up to.
Yeah, you can find me, my name, so at C_Spelliscy, my last name, on Twitter, or DAOcollective.xyz is the DAO Research Collective site that has some resources that we've been funding and helping out with. But yeah, no, pleasure chatting with you both. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Salimi. Thank you, Connor. And thank you, everybody who tuned in today. Also, make sure to follow us on our social media platforms. We are on Twitter and IG. We're NewCoin_NCO and also NewForum. And we also have a private Telegram group where we update everyone what's happening within the Web3 space. And yeah, check all the links out in the bio. And thank you guys so much for tuning in today. And see you in the next episode of NewForum. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you guys for tuning in. Bye-bye.